Penguin.vid presents Dickens, Great Expectations. Great Expectations, by Charles Dickens, publication as a serial from December 1, 1860 to August 1861. In October 1861, in book form. Synopsis. Pip is an orphan, about 7 years old, living on the Kent marshes, with his abusive sister, and her husband, Joe Gargery, a blacksmith. It is Christmas Eve, around 1812, Pip unexpectedly meets an escaped prisoner in the village churchyard, while visiting the graves of his parents and siblings. The prisoner scares Pip into stealing food for him, as well as a metal file to saw off the prisoner's leg iron. Returning with the file, a pie, and brandy, the next morning, Pip discovers a second escaped prisoner, an enemy of the first one. Shortly afterward, both convicts are recaptured, while fighting with each other. When Pip's theft is about to be discovered, the first convict confesses to stealing the items from the smithy, and protects Pip. Pip's pompous uncle, Pumblechook, arranges for him to go to Seta's house, the house of a wealthy woman, Miss Havisham, to play with her adopted daughter, Estella. This house is a strange nightmare world. Miss Havisham wears an old wedding dress everywhere she goes, and keeps all the clocks in her house stopped at the same time. Estella treats Pip coldly and contemptuously. Nevertheless, he falls in love with her, and dreams of becoming a wealthy gentleman, so that he might be worthy of her. He even hopes that Miss Havisham intends to make him a gentleman, and marry him to Estella, but his hopes are dashed when, after months, Miss Havisham decides to help him become a common laborer in his family business. Miss Havisham guides Pip to be apprenticed to Joe. Pip works in the forge, unhappily, struggling to better his education, with the help of the plain, kind Betty, and encountering Joe's malicious day laborer, Orlick. One night, after an altercation with Orlick, Pip's sister, known as Mrs. Joe, is viciously attacked, and becomes a mute invalid. From her signals, Pip suspects that Orlick was responsible for the attack. One day, a lawyer named Jaggers appears with strange news. A secret benefactor has given Pip a large fortune, and Pip must come to London immediately to begin his education as a gentleman. Pip happily assumes that his previous hopes have come true, that Miss Havisham is his secret benefactor, and that the old woman intends for him to marry Estella. In London, Pip befriends a young gentleman named Herbert Pocket, and Jaggers, law clerk, Wemmick. He expresses disdain for his former friends and loved ones, especially Joe, but he continues to pine after Estella. He furthers his education by studying with a tutor, Matthew Pocket, Herbert's father. Herbert himself helps Pip learn how to act like a gentleman. When Pip turns 21 and begins to receive an income from his fortune, he will secretly help Herbert buy his way into the business he has chosen for himself. But for now, Herbert and Pip led a fairly undisciplined life in London, enjoying themselves and running up debts. Orlick reappears in Pip's life, employed as Miss Havisham's porter, but is promptly fired by Jaggers after Pip reveals Orlick's unsavory past. Mrs. Joe dies, and Pip goes home for the funeral, feeling tremendous grief and remorse. Several years go by, until one night, a familiar figure barges into Pip's room, the convict, mcqs, who stuns Pip by announcing that he, not Miss Havisham, is the source of Pip's fortune. He tells Pip that he was so moved by Pip's boyhood kindness that he dedicated his life to making Pip a gentleman, and he made a fortune in Australia for that very purpose. Pip is appalled, but he feels morally bound to help mcqs escape London, as the convict is pursued both by the police and by Compeyson, his former partner in crime. A complicated mystery begins to fall into place when Pip discovers that Compeyson was the man who abandoned Miss Havisham at the altar, and that Estella is mcqs' daughter. Miss Havisham has raised her to break men's hearts as revenge for the pain her own broken heart caused her. Pip was merely a boy for the young Estella to practice on. Miss Havisham delighted in Estella's ability to toy with his affections. As the weeks pass, Pip sees the good in Megwitch and begins to care for him deeply. Before Megwitch's escape attempt, Estella marries an upper-class let named Bentley Drummle. Pip makes a visit to Setta's house, where Miss Havisham begs his forgiveness for the way she has treated him in the past, and he forgives her. Later that day, when she bends over the fireplace, her clothing catches fire, and she goes up in flames. She survives, but becomes an invalid. In her final days, she will continue to repent for her misdeeds and to plead for Pip's forgiveness. The time comes for Pip and his friends to spirit Megwitch away from London. Just before the escape attempt, Pip is called to a shadowy meeting in the marshes, where he encounters the vengeful, evil Orlick. Orlick is on the verge of killing Pip when Herbert arrives with a group of friends and saves Pip. Pip and Herbert hurry back to effect Megwitch's escape. They try to sneak Megwitch down the river on a rowboat, but they are discovered by the police, who Compeyson tipped off. Megwitch and Compeyson fight in the river, and Compeyson is drowned. Megwitch is sentenced to death, and Pip loses his fortune. Megwitch feels that his sentence is God's forgiveness, and dies at peace. Pip feels ill. Joe comes to London to care for him, and they are reconciled. Joe gives him the news from home. Orlick, after robbing Pumblechook, is now in jail. Miss Havisham has died and left most of her fortune to the Pockets. Biddy has taught Joe how to read and write. After Joe leaves, Pip decides to rush home after him and marry Biddy, but when he arrives there, he discovers that she and Joe have already married. Pip asks Joe's forgiveness, promises to repay him, and leaves for Cairo. After working 11 years in Egypt, Pip returns to England and visits Joe, Biddy, and their son, Pip Jr. Then, in the ruins of Setta's house, he meets the widowed Estella, who asks Pip to forgive her, assuring him that misfortune has opened her heart. As Pip takes Estella's hand and they leave the moonlit ruins, he sees no shadow of another parting from her. Crucial points forming questions. 1. Who notably hailed Great Expectations as Dickens' most compactly perfect book? Hence, George Bernard Shaw. 2. Who referred to this novel disparagingly as Pip nonsense? Hence, Thomas Carlyle. 3. What is Pip's real name? Hence, Philip Pierret. 4. What are the aliases that Abel Megwitch uses? Hence, Prentice and Mr. Campbell. 5. Who calls his father as the aged parent? Hence, John Wemmick. 6. Which character in the novel is described as a dry, brown-corrugated old woman with a small face that might have been made out of walnut shells and a large mouth like a cat's without the whiskers? Hence, Sarah Pocket. 7. What action does Jaggers perform obsessively? Hence, he washes his hands. 8. Who takes credit for Pip's rise in social status? Hence, Pumblechook. 9. Who does Pip suspect of being a secret benefactor for the most of the novel? Hence, Miss Havisham. 10. What is Herbert's nickname for Pip? Hence, Handel. 11. In what publication was Great Expectations originally serialized? Hence, All the Year Round. 12. Who is the pale young gentleman? Hence, Herbert. 13. What accident befalls Miss Havisham before her death? Hence, she is burned in a fire. 14. Who can be seen as a direct contrast to Pip? Hence, Drummle. 15. What happens to Compeyson at the end of the novel? Hence, he disappears and is presumed drowned.